The courtroom discussion begins with the prosecutor raising a serious concern about the defendant's recent drug test. The defendant had been released from jail on September 2nd and reported to community corrections the following day for testing. The result came back positive for cocaine, THC, benzodiazepines, and Suboxone. The defense immediately pointed out an important issue. Because the defendant had only recently been released from jail, there was a possibility that the substances detected in his system had been consumed before he was released and before he was technically on bond. But the prosecutor wasn't convinced. The defendant had already spent several days in custody, and while some substances could potentially remain detectable for a period of time, the bigger concern was his history. He already had multiple operating while intoxicated cases. And there was another OWI case pending in Wayne County. The prosecutor argued that the combination of his history and the positive drug test raised a serious public safety concern. The judge agreed that this was the central issue. He wasn't simply looking at one failed drug test. He was looking at the bigger picture. Multiple OWI cases. Prior convictions. Another pending case. And now evidence of continued substance use. The defense argued that there was no evidence the defendant had been driving while under the influence. According to the defense, if the defendant had been using drugs inside his own home, that did not necessarily mean he posed the same immediate danger to the public as someone getting behind the wheel while intoxicated. The attorney proposed another solution. Let the defendant test again. If he failed another test while on bond, that would provide much stronger evidence that he had violated the conditions of his release. The judge listened. But he wasn't satisfied. His concern wasn't limited to whether the defendant had technically violated bond. His concern was what might happen next. The judge pointed to the defendant's history and the repeated OWI charges. At some point, he said, luck runs out. Someone could get behind the wheel. And someone could get hurt. The defense continued arguing that there were alternatives to incarceration. More frequent drug testing. Stricter supervision. Testing several times a week. Even daily testing if necessary. The attorney emphasized that the defendant was not currently driving and argued that the danger to the community could be managed through restrictions. But the prosecutor pushed back hard. There was a pattern, not an isolated mistake. The defendant had previous OWI convictions dating back years, along with more recent cases. The prosecutor also pointed out that the defendant's blood alcohol levels in the underlying cases were allegedly extremely high. The argument was simple. If repeated OWI convictions, another pending case, and continued substance use don't constitute a pattern, then what does? The judge then addressed the bond itself. The defendant had previously been released on personal recognizance. The defense argued that the circumstances had not changed enough to justify revoking that release. But the judge saw things differently. Even if the positive test could not conclusively prove that the defendant used drugs while on bond, the court still had to consider the larger question. Was the current bond appropriate given the defendant's history? After hearing both sides, the judge made his decision. The bond would be increased. Instead of remaining on personal recognizance, the defendant's bond was set at $25,000 cash or surety. The defendant also waived his right to a preliminary examination. The judge explained that a preliminary examination would normally require the prosecution to establish probable cause that the alleged offenses occurred and that the defendant committed them. The defendant confirmed that he understood. Because the preliminary examination was waived, the cases would proceed to circuit court. The defendant stood mute and waived the formal reading of the charges. The court entered not guilty pleas on his behalf. A pre-trial date was then scheduled for September 24, 2025, at 1:30 p.m. But the most important moment had already happened. The defendant had entered the hearing under personal recognizance conditions. He left facing a $25,000 cash or surety bond. And the reason wasn't simply one failed drug test. The court considered the entire history presented during the hearing. Multiple OWI cases. Prior convictions. A pending case in another county. A positive drug test. And concerns about whether continued substance use could eventually lead to another dangerous incident. The defense wanted the court to focus on what could be proven. The prosecution wanted the court to focus on the pattern. And ultimately, the judge focused on public safety. This hearing is a reminder of how quickly a defendant's release conditions can change when a court believes the history and circumstances show an unacceptable level of risk. One case might be viewed as an isolated mistake. But when similar incidents continue to appear, the court may begin looking at the pattern rather than the individual event. And in this case, that pattern was enough for the judge to increase the bond to $25,000. What do you think? Was the judge right to increase the bond, or should the court have allowed stricter drug testing instead of requiring a $25,000 cash or surety bond? Let us know your opinion in the comments. And if you want more courtroom breakdowns, subscribe and stay tuned for the next case. But the judge wasn't convinced. The defense kept coming back to one point: there was no proof that the defendant had used drugs after being released on bond. Maybe the positive test was simply detecting substances consumed before his arrest. Maybe the defendant hadn't driven anywhere. Maybe increased testing would be enough. But the judge wasn't only asking what had already happened. He was asking what could happen next. And that's where the defendant's history became critical. The prosecutor reminded the court that this wasn't his first OWI. It wasn't even his second. He had previous convictions from 2002, 2004, and 2016. There were also more recent cases from 2023 and 2024, including another pending case in Wayne County. Then came another troubling detail. The prosecutor told the judge that the defendant's blood alcohol level in the current cases had allegedly been extremely high, above .30. The courtroom became noticeably more serious. The prosecutor's argument was straightforward. If a person has repeatedly been convicted of impaired driving, continues facing new OWI charges, and then tests positive for multiple controlled substances, the court has to consider whether releasing that person without a meaningful financial condition creates too much risk. The defense disagreed. The attorney acknowledged that the positive test was difficult to dispute. But he argued that there was still no conclusive evidence the defendant had used drugs while on bond. He reminded the judge that the defendant was not driving. And if the concern was substance use, there were other options. The court could order more frequent testing. 3 times a week. Every day, if necessary, the defendant could remain under supervision. The defense argued that incarceration shouldn't automatically be the answer. But the judge had another concern. At some point, supervision only works if the person follows the rules. And the defendant's history suggested that simply trusting him to remain compliant might not be enough. The judge ultimately decided to change the bond. The defendant would no longer remain on personal recognizance. Instead, the court imposed a $25,000 cash or surety bond. Then the judge moved on to the preliminary examination. The defendant was asked whether he understood that by waiving the preliminary examination, he would not have that probable cause hearing and the cases would move forward to circuit court. He said yes. The prosecution also waived the hearing. The defendant then stood mute and waived the formal reading of the charges. The court entered not guilty pleas. The cases were bound over to circuit court. And a pre-trial hearing was scheduled for September 24, 2025, at 1:30 p.m. But the bond decision was the real turning point. The defendant walked into the hearing with a personal recognizance release. He walked out facing a $25,000 financial condition. And that change tells you exactly what concerned the court. It wasn't just the failed drug test. It wasn't just the OWI charges. It was everything together. A repeated history of impaired driving offenses. New charges. A pending case. Positive testing for multiple substances. And the possibility that the same behavior could eventually put another person in danger. The defense wanted the judge to look at what could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution wanted the judge to look at the pattern. The judge ultimately chose to focus on risk. Because in a bond hearing, the court isn't simply deciding what happened in the past. It's also deciding whether the conditions of release are enough to protect the public while the case moves forward. And in this courtroom, the judge decided they weren't. So the bond went up. $25,000 cash or surety. The defendant's cases will now continue in circuit court. And the bigger question remains: was the judge right to increase the bond? Or should stricter drug testing and supervision have been enough? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more real courtroom moments broken down without the confusing legal jargon, make sure to subscribe.